Welcome back to the InfoSec and Osten Show, episode 78. Today will be a Josh solo adventure. I want to focus on ransomware and perhaps touch on our thought process for launching the Breachsense Darkweb API. Last week I briefly mentioned the Hillel Yafa hospital in Israel, which had to postpone medical procedures because they got hit with ransomware. Apparently, now that it's been almost 2 weeks since the original incident, they still haven't recovered all of their data. There's an interesting court case going on right now in the States. Earlier this year, a baby had its umbilical cord wrapped around its neck during birth and ended up with severe brain damage. The baby died a few months later. The mother is suing the hospital because apparently the hospital didn't tell her that they were dealing with a ransomware attack when she was giving birth, which prevented the doctors from running certain tests that would have shown the issue. This is definitely one of the first confirmed deaths due to ransomware. Now, hospitals are probably easy targets. And I'd like to think that if you're a hospital and have the option between buying a new MRI machine or using the budget on cybersecurity, the choice will be clear. And for the most part, a lot of these ransomware groups act with impunity, at least until they bark up the wrong tree. The Revil gang, or Revil? Anyway, it was shut down last week, and I should note this for the second time, after attacking some big names like the Colonial Pipeline, JBS, and Kaseya. Though it seems more like a whack-a-mole type effort because other threat actors like Lockbit 2.0, Clop, Everest have certainly picked up the slack. Meaning, in the data breach space, we see between 10 to 20 new breaches a month, but we see the same number of companies getting hit with ransomware and their data shared online daily. And this is essentially the double extortion model. First, the victim needs to pay up to get their files decrypted. Then they need to pay again so that the ransomware gang doesn't share their data publicly. The level of sophistication these gangs have is quite remarkable. They have biz dev staff to negotiate the ransom. They have countdown timers to add pressure to the victims to comply, and then support staff to help them decrypt the files once they've cooperated. Back when I was pen testing full-time, we'd often get pulled into incident response engagements. Essentially, our job was to figure out how an attacker got in and what data exactly was stolen. And this often decided what level of public notification the company was required by law to do. One of the common issues we'd come across, especially on web app incidents, is the lack of sufficient logging. Meaning, most web servers are configured to log the HTTP method like GET or POST, the URI, the response status, timestamp, along with some other high-level data. But rarely do web servers log the contents of, say, a post request or a server response body, which would obviously make retracing what steps the attacker took much easier. Things like brute force attacks are quite easy to see in logs even without the body, but more targeted attacks can easily fly under the radar, and it's very often these sort of attacks that are used in ransomware. Now, I think there are 3 primary initial attack vectors, or 3 main methods ransomware gangs are using to get their initial foothold within their targets. Once we understand how these attacks work, I think it'll be much easier to protect our companies. The first method uses social engineering. It's often a phishing email with a malicious attachment that perhaps runs a local exploit and then connects back to the attacker's command and control servers. Another common technique is to include a link to a malicious website that's used to steal credentials. And we use this technique in phishing simulations where we'd find a web app belonging to our target that required authentication. Usually this was something like Outlook Web Access or some other critical portal that the majority of the employees needed. We then enumerate employee email addresses, and this is often as easy as figuring out the email format like firstname.last name or first initial last name at whatever the company's email domain was, and then we'd grab a list of employees off of LinkedIn. Finally, we needed to create the fake portal. And nowadays, there are lots of frameworks that automate this for you, but we did it old school style, meaning you'd open up the real portal in your browser, click Save As, and then upload the saved HTML to our server, and we change the form action to point to a script on our end that would collect the credentials. Strangely enough, we almost never needed to get a valid TLS cert for our phishing domain. The overwhelming number of folks had no issues clicking through the browser alerts warning them that the cert was invalid. Finally, we created the phishing email that was sent to the targets. And the ruse was usually that the IT team updated the portal over the weekend and needed users to log into the new one for their accounts to remain valid. And we used scarcity and authority as techniques to trick users into logging into our fake portal. And the technique was extremely effective. We could even bypass 2FA by adding that to our login form and then just authenticating to the real backend server with the 2FA token that was submitted before it expired. The next technique is stolen or leaked passwords. Now, we know that even today, the majority of folks still reuse passwords online. The idea is, say LinkedIn had a breach and the passwords, or to be more accurate, the password hashes were leaked. Malicious users then crack those passwords and try to connect the credentials on other targets to see if the same password is used there as well. This, in fact, was the initial attack vector used against the Colonial Pipeline. The REvil gang found a password belonging to one of their employees and then were able to use it to authenticate to a company VPN. The beauty of using stolen credentials to get in is that it bypasses all the common security measures companies have in place. A valid username and password will get past your firewalls, your intrusion detection systems, and WAFs by design. And back to the logs issues I mentioned before, attackers can run very targeted credential stuffing attacks without locking out accounts, meaning in a traditional brute force attack, an attacker cycles through a large password file like, let's say, RockU, which will inevitably lock out accounts after a certain number of incorrect attempts. End users complain, and the support team usually knows about the attack pretty quick. Not to mention this makes a lot of noise in the logs. A targeted credential stuffing attack has the added benefit that the attacker only tries a limited number of credentials that they already know belong to their target's employees. Accounts don't get locked out because only a single login attempt is made. And the only question is, did the employee or the end user reuse the same password within the organization, or rather for this specific app, or not? Now, besides for third-party data breaches, malicious users take advantage of the double extortion attack like we talked earlier to find PII, as well as more leaked credentials. We recently had a client who was running an incident response investigation for a large bank, the kind that everyone listening to this podcast would recognize. And poring over the logs to figure out what the initial attack vector wasn't very helpful. And searching third-party data breaches for valid credentials proved to be a dead end as well. They ended up using the Breachsense Darkweb API to locate a trove of company files hosted on the dark web, which included internal network information as well as database dumps which contained passwords. So leaked or stolen credentials are not only the most common method used to gain initial access to a target in ransomware attacks, but they're also the root cause of most data breaches today. Finally, the last method to gain initial access is unpatched servers. This could be as simple as searching Shodan or Census for all servers that run a specific version of software that you know to be vulnerable. As an aside, it's also a great method for bug bounties. When a new exploit comes out, just search for every known server that runs that vulnerable version, and then figure out which of those belong to a company that runs a bug bounty program and profit. Now, attackers could also find a specific vulnerability, say like SQL injection in some custom app the target runs, but it's not as scalable. Not to say it doesn't happen, and for large enough targets, the time investment is certainly worth their while. I think the real issue here, though, is shadow IT. It's the servers the blue team doesn't know exist, like when your satellite office decides to spin up a SQL server on an EC2 instance but forgot to shut it down. It's not running on one of your company's IP ranges, and it may not even use the TLS cert from the same CA the rest of your company uses. These are the servers that are hard to protect and the ideal target to gain an initial foothold to access potentially sensitive company data. All right, that's it for this week. Hopefully that makes sense. Thanks so much for joining me on another Josh solo adventure, and I appreciate you tuning in every week to the InfoSec and Notes show, whether this is your first episode or it's been a month or a year. And I'll be back in your earbuds next Thursday morning.